Chapter 5. The Law of Suggestion, Historical. It is axiomatic that nature's laws are of comparatively little use to science as means for the advancement of human knowledge until they have been formulated. Formulation presupposes generalization, and generalization presumes universality. This presumption, however, is subject always to further investigation and to consequent disproof, and it is disproved when an exceptional case is discovered, for nature's laws are immutable and admit of no exceptions. If, therefore, it is found not to be universal, it is not a law, and all conclusions based upon it must be revised. Nevertheless, a universal law must be formulated in terms indicating universality before it can be made generally available for scientific or practical uses. It may have been floating around loosely in human consciousness for ages, and it may have been found useful in specific cases by an indefinite number of individuals. And those individuals may each have formulated a law applicable to his own field of research, yet it is not universally available until someone collates the different classes of cases and crystallizes the thought involved into a concrete form of human expression indicative of universality. When this is once accomplished, however, such as the conservatism of science or the perversity of human nature, the discovery is generally destined to encounter three successive stages of opposition. First, it is met by a universal shout of derision. When that fails to disprove it, as it sometimes does, everybody claims it as his own. When that is disproved, as it sometimes is, each claimant proceeds to cover himself with the dust of old libraries in an effort to prove that it was always known. Newton was not exempt from the usual course of opposition. His discovery was derided in scientific circles. He was encountered by rival claimants. Volumes have been written to prove that there is no such force as the attraction of gravitation, and still others to prove that Newton did not discover gravity. The proof being that the term had been in common use long before Newton was born. Nevertheless, no one has yet succeeded in robbing Newton of the credit of the discovery that the force which the world has consented to designate as gravitation acts with an energy proportion directly as to the mass and inversely as to the square of the distance, and that the formula is as applicable to the apple which falls to the earth as it is to the movements of the planets. Nor is the luster of his name dimmed in the slightest degree by the fact that his discovery was made possible only by Kepler's previous discovery of the laws of the planetary orbits, nor by the fact that the success of his work finally depended upon Picard's correction of the old measurement of a degree of the Earth's surface. All great discoveries are necessarily the resultants of all previous subsidiary discoveries. The laws of duality and suggestion furnish striking examples of laws dimly perceived for ages, used by many, discovered in subsidiary sections, so to speak, and finally formulated as a universal law, and thus rendered available for the uses of all mankind. The great factor in the retardation of the final establishment of the two laws consisted in the fact that they are the necessary concomitants of each other. That is to say, suggestion is necessary to duality, and duality is indispensable to suggestion. In other words, a clear conception of the law of suggestion, as it manifested itself in its protean aspects, was impossible in the absence of the theory of duality, and, on the other hand, duality was inconceivable in the absence of some salient point of differentiation between the hypothetical two minds or states of consciousness. And suggestion furnished a point of differentiation so clear and unmistakable that duality became a logical as well as a psychological necessity. Necessarily, until this concomitant interrelation of the two laws was clearly perceived, and they were formulated together as necessary parts of a psychological whole, the prevailing ideas on the subject were chaotic to the last degree. Thus, the theory of duality has been dimly floating around in the minds of various philosophers, from the time when Greek philosophy ruled the intellectual world until the present age, without seriously affecting the trend of psychological thought. The phenomena indicating it were, of course, the same as they are now, and the theory was often tentatively advanced. But religious thought was apparently hostile to it, and the arguments of the Church were at the time considered unanswerable. Thus, John Locke, in discussing the phenomena of dreams, puts into the mouth of an opponent, real or imaginary, the following paragraph, which is now known to be substantially true. Perhaps it will be said, says Locke, that in a waking man the materials of the body are employed and made use of in thinking, and that the memory of thoughts is retained by the impressions that are made on the brain, in the traces there left after such thinking, but that in the thinking of the soul, which is not perceived in a sleeping man, there the soul thinks apart, and making no use of the organs of the body, leaves no impression on it, and consequently no memory of such thoughts. This position Mr. Locke strenuously repudiates, declares it absurd, and proceeds with an argument against it which, in turn, cannot now be characterized by any milder term than that which he applied to the dual hypothesis. The history of the dual hypothesis, however, is of little interest or scientific importance compared with that of the slow development of the idea which culminated in the formulation of the law of suggestion. As I pointed out in the first chapter, Jesus of Nazareth was the first to give authoritative utterance to that divine law of mental healing which it has taken science 1900 years to rediscover. Jesus was not a scientist, in the modern sense of the word, and he did not attempt to teach his followers by the employment of scientific terms. He simply told them the truth in language that they could comprehend, and when he stated to them that faith was the mental attitude essential to successful mental healing, he epitomized in that one word the whole law of therapeutic suggestion. What is the essence of the law of suggestion? It certainly does not consist of a formula built up of words. Words are merely the vehicle of expression by which one may be made to comprehend the law. What, then, is the central idea embraced in the law of suggestion? It is simply that a certain belief, to wit, a belief in the efficacy of the particular therapeutic agency at hand, has a therapeutic potency. This is all that can be expressed in any form of words, and the word faith, as Jesus employed it, conveyed the central idea so clearly that no one has ever mistaken its exact meaning. Jesus expressed the same idea in different words when speaking of prayer. Therefore I say unto you, all things whatsoever ye pray and ask for, believe that ye have received them, and you shall have them. Obviously, this passage cannot be construed as referring to material benefits, for that would degrade it into a manifest absurdity, and the Master never uttered absurdities. Every word of his was pregnant with significance, and this passage is especially charged therewith. Let us analyze it. It is self-evident, in the first place, that the blessings referred to as conditionally awaiting the suppliant must be either spiritual or therapeutic blessings, or both. They are certainly such as reach the suppliant through the mind, for their realization is distinctly conditioned upon a certain definite mental attitude on the part of the suppliant. That condition is simply belief, otherwise faith. The passage, therefore, is simply another way of reiterating his doctrine that faith is the one essential condition precedent to the realization of benefits that reach the individual through the mind. It is another way of saying that the prayer of faith shall be answered. Moreover, it distinctly excludes the idea that material benefits, such as houses, lands, or money, may thus be attained through prayer. For, obviously, no attitude of mind is capable, per se, of producing a house and lot or a herd of cattle. It also excludes the idea of special, religious intervention in answer to prayer, for the conditions pertain exclusively to the mental attitude of the suppliant. But it does not exclude the implication that prayer is an effective therapeutic agent. It must suffice to note the fact, in this connection, that Jesus evinced a clear comprehension of the central idea involved in the law of suggestion and insistently proclaimed it on every suitable occasion. That it was practically lost to science for more than 1800 years was due to the prevalent materialistic skepticism. That it was not wholly lost is due to the vitality of truth. The words of the Master were, in fact, never wholly lost to view, even by scientists, and the principle has often found a partial expression by scientists who sought to conceal the origin of their ideas by coining a new terminology. Thus, the expectant attention of Carpenter was hailed as a triumph of science and figured largely in its vocabulary for many years, although it was a mere substitute for the word faith and accounted for the same phenomena. Imagination is another word that has performed yeoman service in the vocabulary of science. It has been invoked, time whereof the memory of men runneth not to the contrary, to account scientifically for cures effected without the use of material remedies, and then dismissed with lofty contempt as a subject unworthy of the attention of science. Thus the French Academy, in its report on mesmerism, admitted that marvelous cures had been effected, but learnedly attributed the result to imagination, and thus dismissed the subject as unworthy the further attention of science. Obviously, the word was a mere substitute for that employed by the Master, and a very awkward substitute it was. The employment of the term suggestion, on the other hand, is not a substitution of one term for another, each being descriptive of a definite mental condition. On the contrary, it is a tacit recognition of the fact that faith is the essential condition, and the term itself is merely descriptive of the process necessary to induce that condition. As such, it was a distinct advance in psychic science, even when the law was first formulated as pertaining solely to hypnotism. Its principal value, however, consisted in that it was the beginning of the mental process by which the idea finally became crystallized into a formula expressive of a universal law. To Leibold, of Nancy, belongs the credit of taking this first distinctive step, leading to the discovery of its universality. The credit has been assigned to Braid, of Manchester, notably by Bernheim, of Nancy, who was himself indebted to Leibold for all that he knew of hypnotism. It is true that the world is much indebted to Braid, first, for making hypnotism respectable by giving it a name, secondly, by inventing a new method of inducing the condition, and thirdly, by making a series of experiments illustrative of the suggestibility of hypnotized persons. But it does not seem that he did more than show that the faith requisite for successful mental healing could be induced in a patient's mind by any kind of statement, true or false, provided the hypnotic condition could be first induced. But Paracelsus made a broader discovery than that 300 years before Braid was born, for he distinctly intimated that a false belief, however induced, is just as efficacious for therapeutic purposes as a true one, faith. Being the sole condition precedent, and Pomponazzi, in the 16th century, gave utterance to expressions of identical import. Neither of these old writers, of course, knew anything of hypnotism, but they knew what Braid did not know, namely, that the therapeutic effect of faith is not limited by methods of inducing it, much less by abnormal psychical conditions. But even after the law had been formulated by Leibold, the mystery surrounding mental therapeutics was not dispelled. It was simply shifted to another point of view without increasing the light. Up to that time, hypnotism, per se, was supposed to be, in some mysterious way, the curative agent. When asked for an explanation of its therapeutic potency, the only reply elicited was that it was hypnotism that did the work. In this respect, they were far behind the mesmerists, for they at least had a working hypothesis. Right or wrong, they had a theory of causation that had many facts to support it. Animal magnetism, or the theory of fluidic emanations from the healer, impinging upon the patient, had at least the merit of a valid working hypothesis. This hypothetical fluid, it was held, by its mysterious influence upon the vital principle, re-established functional harmony, and the logic of analogy was invoked in a comparison of its methods and its benefits to those of light, heat, and electricity. But science rejected the theory with hysterical indignation and persistently denied the phenomena until Braid showed that he could reproduce a small part of the phenomena by processes that excluded the fluidic theory. But his master stroke consisted in giving it a new name which implied no theory of causation except that of sleep. This at once placed the whole subject upon a scientific basis, for not only was the name borrowed from the Greek, but it implied no theory of causation beyond what was tangible to the senses. The patients slept and were cured, and that was all there was of it. And so it remained for about 40 years, when Leibold formulated the theory of suggestion. This was resisted for a time by rival schools, but its truth was so obvious and so easily demonstrable that its opponents were at last forced to yield. This, of course, supplied a long-felt want, namely, a theory of causation for hypnotic phenomena, and again hypnotism was placed upon a firm scientific basis. But this, in turn, was unsatisfactory to the rigidly scientific mind and conscience. It was an explanation that did not explain. It simply removed the explanation one step farther back, and thereby deepened the mystery. It is undeniable that in suggestion a mental process is found for inducing in the patient the prerequisite mental condition for healing him, namely, faith. But it is obvious that it is not the suggestion itself that does the healing, although we are frequently given to understand that it is. To read a work of the early suggestive therapeutics, one would imagine that suggestion was an entity that does things. Hence we are told that suggestion does this and does that, and that is all the explanation they are able to give of the science of mental healing. In other words, the rationale of suggestion is not in evidence in their working hypothesis. Nevertheless, it has done, and is still doing, a great work, and it constituted a gigantic stride in the evolution of experimental psychology as applied to mental medicine. But, as I have already pointed out, it required the theory of the dual mind to complete the working hypothesis for mental healing. Under no other theory or possible theory can it be explained why a suggestion is able to induce the requisite mental condition. To say that it works its results by exciting the imagination of the patient is to employ a phrase of indefinite meaning where an intelligent entity is indicated. A suggestion is a statement made by one intelligent being to another presumably intelligent being. Otherwise, it could produce no result, physical or mental. A therapeutic suggestion, in order to be effective, must be a statement addressed to an intelligence whose faith can be stimulated, and who possesses the power to carry the suggestion into effect. Such an intelligence is found in the subjective mind of man. In short, the vital principle of which scientists in all ages have discoursed so learnedly is an intelligent entity, or at least an organized intelligence, controllable by suggestion, and invested with full power to control the vital functions. That this is true is attested by all the facts of psychological science pertaining to the subject matter. Not one fact of either mental or physical science militates against it. I submit, therefore, that, if true, the dual theory is another step in advance toward placing mental medicine upon a scientific basis, in that it shows why suggestion is an effective agency in the cure of disease. But another step is required before suggestive therapeutics can be truly said to be invested with the dignity of a science. It still remains to show how the subjective intelligence is enabled to produce its wonderful therapeutic results. Of course, this can be done only approximately, by showing that the necessary and appropriate machinery exists in all sentient organisms for that purpose. I have already hinted at the subject, but a full discussion of it must be reserved until the third term of our therapeutic formula is reached in its order. In the meantime, enough has been said to justify provisionally the broad generalization of the law of suggestion embraced in the second term of our formula, namely, that the subjective mind is constantly amenable to control by the power of suggestion, and this without reference to the states or conditions, hypnotic or otherwise, of the objective mind. Let me make myself clear upon this point, for its practical significance is as broad as the realm of human intelligence. Bernheim, in pursuance of the then prevailing theory limiting the scope of the law of suggestion to definite pre-existent states or conditions, defines hypnotism as the induction of a peculiar psychical condition which increases the susceptibility to suggestion. The italics are mine. He had previously noted that certain persons were susceptible of suggestion in their apparently normal state, to a more or less limited extent, and he also knew that hypnotized persons are, as a rule, more easily controlled by suggestion than they are in a normal state. Hence his apparently correct conclusion that hypnotism merely increases the susceptibility to suggestion. But therein lurks a fundamental error, for it implies a limitation that does not exist. It would be more exact and truthful to define hypnotism as the induction of a peculiar psychical condition which releases the subjective mind from the dominance of adverse autosuggestions. The subjective mind is constantly controllable and controlled by suggestions, coming either from without or from within, the latter arising from habits of thought, or settled principles, or convictions, or prejudices. As I have pointed out in previous chapters, they are termed autosuggestions or self-suggestions, and they often prevail against suggestions from others. As in all other contending forces of nature, the stronger necessarily prevails. Obviously, it was the lack of a clear conception of this fundamental principle that led the Leibold-Bernheim school of suggestionists to assume limitations to the law of suggestion, or, what was equally unscientific, to imagine that there can be exceptions to a law of nature. It must be said in extenuation, however, that when they began their investigations the prevailing ideas were in a chaotic state, and further, that, for the mere purposes of practical therapeutics, the hypothesis, as they formulated it, was sufficiently near the truth to give them the machinery of suggestion to work with. On the other hand, now that it is known to be a universal law of the subjective mind, it is at once seen that its field of usefulness is as wide as the domain of human thought, and that, of all the laws of the human soul, the law of suggestion is the most important, so long as it inhabits the mortal body. I have elsewhere shown that amenability to suggestion is a limitation pertaining solely to this life, and that in the future life it is no longer in evidence. the soul being endowed with the godlike power of intuitive perception of all truth pertaining to its well-being in its stage of development. I cannot repeat the discussion here for obvious reasons. It must suffice, in this connection, to point out some of its uses in this life outside the domain of mental therapeutics. Nor will the intelligent reader be surprised when he is told that the law of suggestion is a factor of equal importance in every other field of human activity. For instance, it is the one all-important factor in the education and development of children, morally as well as intellectually. As in mental therapeutics, it has been ignorantly employed throughout all the ages, and its variant effects have resulted from the accidents of environmental conditions and not from a knowledge of the law itself, and ignorance, in fact, of its existence. Nevertheless, the law existed from the very beginning of sentient life, and it has performed its mission as a civilizing agent in all the variant stages of human development. As in mental therapeutics, it is adapted to all conditions and performs its humanizing mission in spite of ignorance and superstition. But, again, as in mental therapeutics, certainty and permanency of results can be achieved only when man understands the law and intelligently applies it to its legitimate uses. When that knowledge is attained, every mother will have in her own hands an easy and absolutely certain means of controlling the energies of her children and directing them into whatever channels of activity she may elect. It is axiomatic that knowledge is power and know thyself is a time-honored injunction to mankind. Combining them, it may be truly said that to know thyself is the certain means of obtaining power and dominion over others. Without unduly anticipating what is to be said in future chapters of this book, it may be said that when the parent is armed with a knowledge of the law of suggestion, he is possessed of the means, not only of directing and controlling the general education of his children, but of directing the moral trend, anticipating bad habits or curing them when formed, removing undesirable or vicious traits of character, inspiring industry and ambition, and even of removing or neutralizing the mental or moral obliquities due to heredity. Nor are the mental and moral effects of suggestion confined to the young, for adult criminals may thus be reformed and restored to usefulness, although with less certainty of immediate results. Bad habits may be eradicated in the adult, as well as in the child, by the judicious employment of suggestion. Other things being equal, the effect is the same. Nor is this all, for good suggestions, of whatever character they may be, or to whomsoever they may be addressed, invariably react upon the character of the suggester. It is impossible for one to suggest moral principles to another without being morally benefited himself. It is impossible for one to be a drunkard when he is employing suggestion for the eradication of drinking habits in another. I have known men to be utterly unable to bear the smell or taste of liquor after making a series of strong and vigorous suggestions to a drunkard that the taste or smell of liquor would thereafter make him sick. I knew one, a moderate but habitual user of intoxicants, to be made violently ill by taking a small drink of whiskey after making such a series of suggestions to a drunkard. This occurred to him 3 times in succession before he divined the cause. He was an amateur suggestionist, and not well grounded in the principles of the science he was practicing. Otherwise, he would have known that under the law of duality an autosuggestion is as effective as a suggestion from another. The objective mind suggests, and the subjective mind accepts and believes the suggestion and performs its functions accordingly. In other words, it takes note of the suggestion made to another as to the effect of liquor upon him, and with the inexorable deductive logic of the subjective mind, it deduces the conclusion that the taste of liquor will make anybody sick. I have known several hypnotists who lost their former drinking capacity after treating others for the eradication of the habit. Some of them realized the reason, and some did not, which is but another way of saying that some knew less than others about the intricate workings of the law of suggestion. I have, in fact, never known one who has been able to retain his capacity to drink liquor, even moderately, after treating others for the habit of drunkenness, without a determined effort to do so, that is to say, by resorting to a course of vigorous autosuggestions. It will thus be seen that autosuggestions are as effective for the eradication of bad habits as are the suggestions of others, and I unhesitatingly affirm that anyone can thus relieve himself of any habit he sincerely desires to get rid of. But it often happens that the patient has no real desire to be rid of his habit, and this constitutes an adverse autosuggestion which necessarily defeats the object. The same remark applies to all suggestions for the eradication of habits, from whatever source they may emanate. This, however, is a slight digression. The point which it is desired to enforce is that all suggestions to a patient react upon the one who makes the suggestion. As has been before remarked, action and reaction are always equal, and the principle is as true of mental as of physical energy. As the teacher is benefited by fixing the lesson taught more firmly in his own mind, so is a suggestion, moral or therapeutical, beneficial to him who makes it. Like the quality of mercy, it is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes.